Today we're going to talk about this wonderful book on Twitter, and we have the author here with us. Dhiraj, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Dhiraj Murthy. I'm a senior lecturer of sociology at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and my work tends to be on big data, social media, and a lot of work specifically on Twitter, as the book indicates.
Yes, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I have a number of questions for you. First, can you just briefly tell us what inspired you to write this on Twitter?
Absolutely. One of the big things that inspired me to write the book in a lot of ways was I saw a lot of interest coming from people in, especially the domain of computer science, that saw Twitter as really exciting because they had huge social media data sets that were coming through, and there were a lot of interesting big data methods that were developing, and people in computer science were really jumping on it. But I saw that in the social sciences, and sociology, and anthropology, and political science, economics, etc., there wasn't the same sort of enthusiasm. In a sense, the feeling I got was they almost sort of saw Twitter as quite banal. People tweeting about what they were eating, people tweeting about the silly things of everyday life, but they didn't really see the medium as something serious, as a serious academic object of study. So for me, the book presented an opportunity to say, hey, wait a second, this is worth a book, which was a lot of the resistance I first got from talking to people when I was talking to colleagues. I said, a book about Twitter, this is going to be outdated by the time you write it, why bother? And I think that only egged me on. It sort of got me thinking, well, actually, even if the medium disappears, the whole idea of short-form microblogging will have an effect on our social communication.
Yes. So if you can summarize in a couple of words, who you think is the intended audience for your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of coming from that, I definitely wanted to make a case to fellow scholars. So they're definitely part of the intended audience was to say, hey, look, we need to think about this as an object of study. Another big audience was actually students, because I had a lot of students sending me emails when I was doing just work on Twitter in journals and at conferences saying, hey, is there more we can learn about this? So very much a big part of the book was to target students and to show them the different domains that Twitter research could encompass, and also the general public. If one of the things when I was looking around on Amazon and just on the bookshelves and you see Twitter books, it was how can you set up a Twitter business in 140 days? How can you, make money on Twitter? How can you do marketing by Twitter? But there was nothing that was academic for the public. So I thought it would be interesting for lay readers as well. So those three audiences, I think, were who I was trying to target.
So in your book, you're talking about different domains where Twitter can be used and is being used. In particular, you cover journalism, disasters, activism, and health. So could you briefly discuss why you think it's important to focus on these four domains?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll kind of hit upon the four very briefly to sort of tell you my thought process of that. One of the things I did in preparing for the book was to sort of look at the chronology of adoption by different user bases around the world. And I saw journalists as some of the first early adopters along with technologists, but a lot of people in San Francisco who were in the media and journalism industries were kind of flocking to Twitter at a very early time. So journalists had been present on the medium from the early days. And I think that gave the medium a large sense of both news production and consumption, which I think trickled also to citizen journalists, who I mentioned in the book. So the fact that at the same time Twitter was starting to take off, we had the first versions of the iPhone, which made it really easy to take a picture and pick that along with a message. And I give particular cases in the book, such as the downing of the US Airways flight on the Hudson. And I think that was a big hallmark event and other events for citizen journalism and for journalists alike. And I think for disasters, you kind of connect the two, because that particular incident is also a disaster and it's a journalistic event. And I think giving people the opportunity, citizen journalists, to document disasters and share information was very big for Twitter. It also, I think, gave, as more tweets were coming out, governments and emergency services an indication that they should also be looking at the data, because they could actually see what people were doing on the ground. Sometimes people were doing the right things during a disaster, sometimes they were doing the wrong things, such as during Sandy. And one of the cases I wanted to make in the book was the importance of both sides of that for the disaster, and also the differences of different parts of the world as well. And the specific case I look at in the book of Pakistan and floods is that a lot of times we think of Western disasters, but we need to also kind of think about other spaces in terms of disasters too. And I think one of the big things that's really captivating me recently, there's been a lot of coverage on activism, and my book does talk about that. And I think one of the areas that's increasingly getting coverage but still not enough is health. And that's one of the domains I saw really emerging with Twitter, and it's really kick-started, I think, in the last year or so. And there was an incident, which is post the coverage of the book, but of Lisa Bonchek-Adams, who was covered prominently in the media. There were articles in The Guardian, as well as other newspapers, saying people shouldn't be tweeting about their cancer experience. And my book particularly looks at cancer and Twitter. And one of the arguments I make inside of there is actually Twitter can be phenomenally important in constructing patient communities, but also bringing people out of isolation. If you've got a major chronic health problem, such as cancer, sometimes you just have bad days and you want to tweet about it. What initially people may have thought of as boring or banal could be really life-saving for people if they're saying, I had a really tough time with chemotherapy today, and they're kind of reaching out to this unintended audience. So those were some of the reasons why I chose those four domains. I thought they would be engaging to people and help them understand where I was coming from.
Yes. Well, the other question I have, we know that a lot of researchers interested in using Twitter data to do all kinds of interesting analysis, including those 4 different areas. And we know that Twitter recently announced a grant where researchers worldwide can apply for this data grant and essentially potentially get access to the historical Twitter data. So in your opinion, what do you think can we learn from this data?
Quite a lot. I think one of the things, and thanks for asking the question, both in the introduction, but particularly in the conclusion, one of the things I raise is, and at that time it was the Library of Congress who was going to be archiving Twitter data, right? So the idea was researchers would go to the Library of Congress, they'd have to physically sit in front of a computer to extract data sets. And it's still very hard to get Twitter data unless you have the Firehose, which is the complete Twitter data stream. It costs a lot of money to access that. So it's outside of the purview of normal academic researchers. I think this marks a very fundamental change in how researchers are going to access Twitter data. So if we think to my book as not necessarily a historical account of Twitter, because it does take theoretical perspectives, but empirically, it's at a different stage than where we're going to get it with the sort of data that's going to be released in this way. One of the big things I think that this is also going to give us is, as the Library of Congress idea that I talk about in the conclusion indicates, is complete Twitter data. One of the big issues we have is if you're trying to get bits of Twitter data, you're going to have all sorts of issues with that. So I think the fact that people could say, okay, I want to look at this and have historical hypotheses is very different to now you have to be collecting data, right? You have to proactively be doing it, and then you can ask those questions. But what if you haven't been collecting data and you come up with a novel research question and you don't have the data to work with? It's kind of created various problems. So I think this gives us an opportunity to ask maybe novel, reflective questions that before a lot of Twitter research has been kind of in the moment. So you're thinking, okay, something's come up, we need to think about it, actively responding. And that's been very interesting from a methodological perspective, but I think this will open up work to maybe people who have not been able to work in such a fast-moving way, and they'll be able, for example, historians, who could then look at that data, or social historians, and reflect more upon it. So I think it could change things quite a bit, potentially.
And what advice would you give to researchers who are just considering, to use Twitter data in their own research?
I think it's tremendously complicated. So to go back to the last question, to add on that, prima facie, it may be easier because we have a Twitter, data grant program that could come out and we could have access. But I think one of the flip sides of that, and something not to warn off people from doing Twitter work, but to kind of go to your question of advice, is all big data has biases. And I think in this case, one of the things we have to be aware of is what biases can be introduced and how can we think about that proactively in terms of our research questions. So one of the issues historically with Twitter research has been sampling bias. So if you collect data, and I've had to deal with that when writing the book, with the spritzer stream, which is basically the free publicly accessible version, which most people have used except for the first Twitter researchers, you basically are getting about 1% of tweets. And most of the data work, because not everyone's going to get access to Firehose or to historical complete Twitter data, so people going in will have to understand that yes, you can access tweets for free, but you probably are only going to get 1% of tweets unless you've got very small search parameters. Another thing is the API often buffers the tweets it gives you, so that can have its own biases. My work has found, for example, when you run spritzer requests, it can often, I mean, one, it's with a spritzer, it's giving you everyone, but if you run search queries, it tends to buffer Twitter users who are known to tweet. So to give you a specific example, my work has looked at geolocation, so I'm interested about Twitter users and location, and often the API can buffer people and just say, okay, we're going to return these results because it's computationally less expensive for us to do that. So one of the pieces of advice coming from this, I would encourage people to think about is really think critically about the data and what you aim to get out of it, rather than just saying, oh, Twitter, that's very interesting. It's got so much data on so many questions. Think about the data as a data object. What is it that you're trying to get out? And if you're asking geographic questions, if you're asking questions about text, what are the limitations, but also what are the possibilities? Because there's a tremendous amount of issues you've got to deal with when you're doing Twitter searches.
So in addition to some data biases that may be introduced during your sampling process, are there any ethical considerations that a researcher might want to consider using Twitter data, even if it's just public Twitter data?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent follow-on question, in the sense of one of the attractions, especially in social research, but also in computing domains of Twitter data, is there is just so much. Let's connect back to the domains you asked about in my book. Let's take two particular domains that I think raise ethical questions very easily. That's activism, which I didn't get to talk about, and health. Activism, let's say there's people tweeting in sensitive political areas. A lot of activists are pretty savvy now, and they know that if they tweet, they're being monitored. But a lot of times people who are new to activism, young, potentially vulnerable, they may be tweeting information which could compromise their identity, which could put them in personal danger. So if we're writing about that, especially if we're blogging, a lot of researchers working on social media may be blogging about things pretty real time, and we're disclosing that and connecting dots that they may not have known when they're tweeting. So we for example, use social network analysis. When we put together a network of people, we may just be handing that whole network to a government, for example. So I think we have to think really carefully about the fact that when people are tweeting, they may be tweeting for very different reasons than our own academic research. So we have to be sensitive to that vulnerability. In health, I look at a lot of tweets of people saying, I just got diagnosed with cancer today, or I just found out today I'm gonna die. So if we're dealing with that sort of data in the textual frame of a tweet, I think one of the ethical considerations we have to think about is what impact that's gonna have on our respondents. And one of the issues here is that a tweet is technically published, right? So you are allowed to go through, and journalists often do this. They say, at XP528, which is not a real, maybe it's a real Twitter user. If it is, I'm sorry, but probably not. Tweeted this, right? And they embed the tweet, and that's perfectly legal. Newspapers do that all the time. But as academic researchers, I think we have to think twice when we do that, especially in sensitive domains. So my advice would be, don't just think of it as published, though it technically is. Let's go one layer further and think of it as an actual part of social communication. And if we were to have actual respondents who we interviewed, we'd go a couple more layers. So at least let's think ethically about what impact this may have on the people tweeting. And I've tried to frame a little bit of that in my book as well, to say tweets can be very intimate occurrences for people. They may be tweeting as a form of diary writing, for example, and maybe disclosing things that they didn't intend for the whole world to see, even though the whole world can see it.
So I have another question. It's a kind of bigger picture question. Based on your work in this area, what do you think are major future trends that we can expect to see for Twitter as a platform, but also for Twitter as a research option?
Yeah, one of the ways I think we can look at that is within the book, and especially when I was writing it, one of the things I was trying to differentiate is between Facebook and Twitter. It's a question I often get from students. What's the difference between Facebook and Twitter? Obviously, they know what the difference is, but from an academic point of view, because they're both parts of social networking. They both have elements of social media, but they're both of a different age. So if we think Facebook recently turned 10, and there was a lot of media coverage of a decade of Facebook, and if we think of Facebook and academic research, it's very mature. Facebook, for example, has a very developed Facebook Fellow program where academics go into Facebook, spend time, they get access to complete Facebook data, work with Facebook researchers, and there's a very developed Facebook data program there. I think one of the future trends for Twitter research is that it most likely will follow Facebook in a lot of ways. Twitter's gone public now. It's a publicly traded company. It's got obligations to its shareholders, just like Facebook does. And when Facebook has brought, and this is a contentious area, so partially the comparison I'm raising is because some academics have found real problems with working with Facebook because it's kind of walled garden system. And they've loved Twitter from the beginning, especially people in computer science and computational social science, because you just go and get the data. You don't have to, all you have to do is, all you have to do, but you have to adhere to Twitter's terms of service. And as long as you adhere to that and you're not reselling the data, using it for commercial things, you can do a lot with it. We never had access with that with Facebook, really, unless you were scraping it and that violated their terms and conditions. So I think one of the big trends that we have to think about is as Twitter becomes more corporatized in terms of its data, and maybe this Twitter data grants is signaling that they're going to close things and it's only going to be select people that are coming in will have access. How will that change things? Is it going to make Twitter less of a kind of open data platform and make it more like Facebook? So I think one of the future trends we need to look at, not to be a complete pessimist, is are we going to have more closed things that we have to deal with? Or is it going to stay open? And if it's going to stay open, is it going to become more open? So to kind of be more optimistic, is the Twitter data grants program part of that we're going to get more and more access? And if that's the case, we're going to see some pretty exciting research that maybe is more real time, that maybe has access to more data that's closer to 100% level.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dhiraj. And again, check it out. It's a social communication in the age of Twitter.